everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our ECHO session today on compassionate companionship, navigating grief together. And of course, we are holding this session in honor of the National Grief and Bereavement Day that took place on November 21st. Before we get into this presentation, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that the land on which I'm presenting from, the city of Gatineau, is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I acknowledge the historical oppression of lands, cultures, and the original peoples in what we now know as Canada, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. Briefly, regarding the Palliative Care ECHO Project, the Palliative Care ECHO Project is a 5-year national initiative to help cultivate communities of practice and establish continuous professional development among healthcare providers across Canada who care for patients with life-limiting illness. We encourage you to check out our website at echopalliative.com. And the Palliative Care ECHO Project is supported by a financial contribution from Health Canada. Therefore, the views shared here do not necessarily represent the views of Health Canada. Many of you might know Pallium Canada for our LEAP content and courseware. Predominantly our LEAP core, one of our biggest courses, is an interprofessional course that focuses on the essential competencies to provide a palliative care approach. It can be delivered online or in person. And of course, it is ideal for any healthcare professional accredited by the CFPC and the Royal College. We encourage you to check out our website for more information about LEAP Core. Introduce myself. So my name is Diana Vince. I'm the Palliative Care ECHO Project Manager at Pallium Canada. And today we have with us Matthew Fillier, Grief and Bereavement Practice Lead, Palliative Care Network from Nova Scotia Health. A couple of welcome and reminders. So for comments, please use the chat function. And thank you so much for introducing yourselves. I do see that the chat is moving along. For any questions, I do urge you to please use the Q&A function. You may hover at the bottom of your screen and find the Q&A function to type in any questions that you may have. Questions will be addressed at the end of the session. The session is being recorded, and this recording and the slide deck will be emailed to all registrants within the next week or so. Please remember not to disclose any personal health information during this session. For the conflicts of interest, Pallium Canada, as mentioned before, is a non-for-profit organization partially funded through a contribution by Health Canada. We also generate our funds to support operations and research and development from our course registration fees and sales of the Pallium Pocketbook. I myself, along with the presenter, do not have anything to disclose. And without further ado, I will now pass it along to our presenter.
Thank you so much, Diana. Thanks for having me from everyone at ECHO Hub. And friends, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today to learn a little bit more about grief. In today's presentation, we've only got about an hour, so I'm going to cover a lot of ground. So I won't be looking at the chat too much right now, but I can't wait to read it afterward. If you've got questions, we're going to try to address those as best we can, and you can always email me later. I'd be happy to do that. If you can't tell already, I'm from Newfoundland, so I'm genetically predisposed to speaking quickly. I will try to throttle it back for you today, but the good news is it's being recorded, so you can watch it again and again and pin it to your web browser. It'll be great. So welcome, everybody. I'm glad you're here. Okay, so our goal in this session is to really increase grief literacy. It's a foundational session for us. And if I could change one thing about society and culture right now, it would be to affect grief literacy, to increase it. It's just really poor right now, in my humble opinion. I'm going to help you try to understand a little bit of the science of grief and then unmask some myths, stigmas, euphemisms, and platitudes that kind of create this sort of toxic soup around grief that's not very helpful for us in our culture, and instead offer some supportive alternatives. We'll use some evidence-based approaches, and we want to focus on grieving well. That's one of the things on behalf of Nova Scotia Health, and particularly the Palliative Care Network, I want to express today, that we like to live well, die well, grieve well. There's a lot of shame and stigma and judgment in the world of grief, where we talk about grieving right or wrong, good or bad, right? So just to grieve well, that's what we're going to focus on today. I want to mention right away that it's okay if you're not okay. Grief is highly personal and individualistic. And so if anything in this session touches on something that really is a trigger for you, causes a reaction, it's okay to have some self-compassion. You know, if you need to walk away and come back and watch it later or not watch it at all, that's just fine. We're all learners here as well. I'm always a little bit suspicious of anyone who says they're like the world's leading expert in grief, because really the person who's the grief expert is you. While grief is universal, it's highly individualistic and nobody grieves the same way. So you are the expert here. I'm just sharing my knowledge and experience with you. I wanted to start today with a quote from Brene Brown. This is from Rising Strong, and I do love this quote very much with grief. And she writes, "Our silence about grief serves no one. We can't heal if we can't grieve, and we can't forgive if we can't grieve. We run from grief because loss scares us, yet our hearts reach towards grief because the broken parts want to mend." C.S. Lewis wrote, "No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. We can't rise strong when we're on the run." And we're going to talk about how our central nervous system gets fired up about loss and grief and often makes us want to run or fight or freeze a little bit later. And also, we don't want to run away from the discomfort of grief. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit of my grief story because I guarantee everyone on the call has one, if not many. And I'm happy to share that with you just a bit to give you my experiential lens and then kind of my background and role. So these two rascals here are my mom and dad. This is Bob and Audrey Fillier. We're all from Newfoundland originally, as I mentioned. They're probably out west in their 20s before I ever came on the scene. A little bit about my mom. My mom at my birth was diagnosed with primary biliary cirrhosis of the liver. It was genetic through her family. Her twin died at birth. And mom was given about 10 years to live, and she died just after my 10th birthday. So my mother raised me always knowing that she was chronically ill and that she would never see me grow up, right? My dad, she was the love of his life. And so my dad had a bit of a nervous breakdown when my mom died. He threw himself into his work, becoming a workaholic and trying to handle his grief that way. That resulted in chronic illness midlife for my dad of various types. Um, he remarried once, and that partner died of chronic illness. So he did this journey twice with partners. His third time round in life of being remarried, he developed pancreatic cancer, and my dad died just a few years ago. Well, around about when my mom died, both sets of my grandparents died. So my dad's parents both died of cancer. We looked after them at home. And my mom's parents, my Pop Cooper died, and within 2 days, my Nan Cooper literally grieved herself to death. We did a double open casket funeral for them. So you can imagine all of the tumult, all the uncertainty that comes from all those losses all the time. And I've moved, I'm 42, I've moved 18 times in my life to give you a sense of the instability that I've been through. And you can imagine what that does for development, for the way you do attachment, your relationships, your ability to cope, your resiliency. It affects everything. And I can honestly say, in terms of my background, that my community of faith literally saved my life. I'm lucky to have a community of faith around me, and that's why I went into ordained ministry in the United Church of Canada for the last 20 years. So I got to be in places and in conversations with people that most folks never have the opportunity to be in those places and that kind of level of trust. So I have a very particular relationship with grief and bereavement across a vast spectrum of Canadians from all kinds of backgrounds and all kinds of places. And right now, as Dinah said, my role is as the grief and bereavement practice lead at the Palliative Care Network here in Nova Scotia. And we're trying to build community capacity and integrated grief and bereavement strategy across the province so that every Nova Scotian has a pathway to care, and that we work together between community and our organization to build all kinds of bridges and network so that you can always get good care wherever you go, because we know grief has no timeline. So we've got to work together on this. It's an exciting time in the grief world, and I'm happy to talk about it. So as we go through the session, I just wonder, how has grief shaped your life? Just want to keep that question in the background. One of my favorite um, sorry there, I had my phone say something very strange. One of my favorite metaphors for grief is hold the baby in bereavement. And this was from Bianca Newman, who's the head of bereavement at Sue Ryder in the UK. It's a nonprofit. And typically we think about grief like a lot in stages of grief, you'll hear. And the thing about stages of grief that I think works so well for our capitalist culture is, unlike how Kubler-Ross kind of constructed it, it comes with a beginning, middle, and end, right? There's 5 or so stages. You have a start and an end point. So, you should be able to get through your stages in your 3-day bereavement leave, or hopefully as soon as possible, so we can get you back to being the parent, the person, the worker that you used to be, so you can get back out there and produce, right? And unfortunately, that's a bit of a corruption of the way that she thought about stages of grief. And Bianca really gave us an interesting way to think about our grief. What if we thought about grief this way? What if your grief was like walking into a room one day and you're confronted with this little wiggly screaming baby? What are you going to do with this little human? Because it's really about entering into relationship with our grief. It's about deciding whether we are going to be present to it or not, or present with someone who's grieving or not. So just hold that metaphor in your mind. Like, how would we respond? Would we come to the baby and rub them on the shoulder and say, oh, my thoughts and prayers are with you? Or will we rub them on the shoulder and say, gosh, what stage are you? It's hard to tell with all the screaming. Is it anger or denial? And can you call me back when we get to acceptance? Would we give them a card and say, I'm really sorry for your loss. By the way, we have a big presentation to do in about 3 weeks' time. So if you can just wrap this up, that'd be swell. Is our response in relationship with the grief that's showing up in ourselves and in the people we're sharing the journey with? That's the key question, I think, for grief, is to be in relationship with it rather than trying to detach from it, sweep it under the rug, deflect it. So I like to say that replacement is the displacement of emotion. And when we are uncomfortable with grief and we try to fill it in some other way or try to evade it, we displace the emotional reaction of grief, and that causes all kinds of bad things. So let me give you an example of this, and I'll keep the details really general. I've had this scenario play out several times in my time in ministry. So the one that comes to mind is I had a young father who was a single father. His partner died, tragically of cancer. And at this point in time, his mother is dying. And, he's doing the whole thing. He's there as much as possible with his mom. And we're getting quite concerned for his well-being. So everybody kind of reminds him, hey, you need to go home, get a shower, get something to eat, get some good sleep, and come back. And the nurse says, hey, we'll call you if anything changes. And this, plays out all the time across the country. So he goes home, gets the shower, and before he's even out of the shower, the phone rings, and it's the nurse, and she's frantic on the other end saying, I think your mom is dying right now. Really need you to come to the hospital as soon as possible. So just imagine your reaction as a griever in that moment. What is your nervous system doing? What is your body doing? How are you reacting to this news? You're going to get in a motor vehicle and drive to the hospital. Do you even know what you're doing? How are you responding to that? Right? So he bolts down the road, gets to the hospital, gets to the unit, and the nurse meets him at the door and says, I'm really sorry for your loss. Your mom has died. We really need her room for the next patient. So can you just go in, and how long will it take for you to collect her things? Now, it's really easy to turn the nurse into some kind of monster. How mean could that person be? And of course, it was incredibly traumatizing for that dad, which I'll talk about in a second. But I want us to appreciate that when we aren't grief literate, we're probably not grieving well in the first place. And it's more helpful to assume people are always doing the best they can with what they have to work with. I try to appreciate for the nurse that I don't know what kind of operational pressure she's under. Maybe there was a team discussion and they all went, we need this room, and no one wants to talk to the dad to tell him this news. So you get the short straw. Maybe she's in grief herself going, I got into this to do person-centered care, and I'm in a system that's not letting me do that and honor the time I want to spend with this dad. I can't imagine what her life is like and what she's going through in that moment. And because we're under that pressure of like, we just got to go and get the next person in there, that's what people want to see, is those wait times going down and us churning people out. We actually don't take the time to be in relationship and understand each other. So for the father, he was highly traumatized by this event. He cleaned everything out in the room, and it only took a few days before he was seeking real intervention in his mental health, which we walked him through. It affected all of his relationships and his relationships with his kids. And all of that could have shifted if we simply had the mindset that we need to be in relationship with our grief, and we need to be more grief literate about what's happening and the impacts it has on people. So always remember too that, our ability to cope and our resilience, my goodness, that's so diverse. So that's why I really like that lens of trying to remind ourselves, assume people are doing the best with what they've got to work with. You'll be a lot happier in life as well, let me tell you. So, if we think about, hey, like grief seems so ubiquitous, like it's kind of everywhere, like it's not that big a deal, right? Well, think about the impact on that grief baby we're talking about in our lives. If we are so disconnected, like we talked about in that first slide, and we rely on those platitudes and those unhelpful ways of dealing with grief, we're probably going to have trauma, relationship issues, attachment, coping, resilience skills are all going to be challenged, right? That's good for nobody. The Canadian Grief Alliance tracked 10,083,726 people in 2019 were grieving a COVID-related death. Imagine what that number is today, and that's just one kind of death that we've been through recently in a tidal wave of grief going through our world and our country and our communities. So, think about a death could affect 5 people, or as the Alliance likes to say, somewhere close to 1.5 million Canadians. This is huge. This has a huge impact. We really need to give grief and bereavement its day and its focus. And that's what always excites me about these kind of conversations. And just to note that they're not really included the wider impact there when they give you that stat. So in Nova Scotia, here's how we're thinking about grief a little bit, and colleagues across the country will be familiar with this. This is the Irish hospital model of care for grief and bereavement, and we've adapted it for use in Nova Scotia. So I'm just sharing that with everybody. The big thing to say about this is, you can go up or down on the triangle, but the good news for this is the vast majority of people we meet in grief and bereavement are at moderate or low risk and can be helped with community-driven initiatives, let alone some of our professional services. Very few people need specialized therapeutic care for complex grief and mental health. And that is good news because it means we can really grieve well if we just think about it differently and enter into relationship with it. So I want to remind folks, the takeaways for me is just that grief is non-pathological. You'll hear me say it a bunch. And that really this proactive model is evidence-based, focuses on prevention, collaboration. How can we work together in community and professional services so that the majority of grief needs can be met? And so we avoid further complications for people. Like that father that I mentioned, he then relied on the mental health system to support him, right? But that might not have been necessary if we had been able to really have early intervention there. And I want to remind people of that. I'll say that a bunch. Grief is individual. Only you grieve the way you do, and yet everybody grieves. It's, I think, a fundamental part of the human condition, which I rarely say, is that people lose in their lives and people find in their lives. So if we close at that metaphor of the baby and the bereavement, how might that change our relationship with our grief and the grief of others? Right, just a summary slide to remind us about some key takeaways from that metaphor that I think are really, really important. It's really key to check our assumptions, do our own grief discernment about how we relate to it, get to know ourselves with our grief, and ground ourselves so that we really can listen to understand and not to fix. So the thing that's different with grief is it's not a disease. I can't prescribe you an antibiotic for it that'll make it go away and you'll never think about it again. We're not asking what's wrong with somebody. We're asking, hey, what's happening with you? Can you tell me about that? We're entering into relationship. And I got to put a shout out there. I know there's lots of hospice and palliative care folks on here. I got to say, in the 20 years that I've been in ministry, I am absolutely blown away by the level of care that I've seen, at least in Nova Scotia, and I'm sure it's true across the country, of all the staff in palliative care departments. They're incredible and have made some of the most Olympic level changes in people's lives because of the compassion they show. And I really like the nurse approach because this is good for all parts of life. It's not just relegated to healthcare. If someone's telling you how they're feeling about a loss they've just experienced, their grief, name it. That is so important. Feed that back to them. Yes, I understand that you feel overwhelmed. I can see that you feel overwhelmed. Understand instead of fixing what they're saying. So, just feeding back to them. It feels like there's so much going on for you right now. How can I help? Respecting that experience is so important. owning that everyone has their own experience. Just because my mom died doesn't mean I know everything there is to know about parental death. So I will always say to someone, I don't know what you're going through, and I think you're so courageous to face this. Courage is just fear that said its prayers, right? And a lot of times when we're in that moment, that's kind of what we need to get through. And being validated that way is really important. Support the griever. It's saying, listen, I know you're not alone in this, but can I keep checking in with you? And one of the things that happens to a lot of people who are grieving is that there's this massive amount of support leading up to the death, and then perhaps at the funeral ritual, and then it fades out very quickly over time for lots of reasons. But that leaves people kind of feeling isolated and alone, and sort of like they're a grief leper, if you will, like no one wants to be around them. So if you take the time to just reach out with a phone call and say that's why you're calling. I'm just calling because, Terry only died a couple of weeks ago, and I'm just wondering how you're doing. You're just on my mind, on my heart, right? Makes all the difference in the world. They may not want to engage. They may draw a boundary on that, but the fact that you reach out will never be looked, will never be frowned upon. And explore with open-ended questions. One of my most favorite ones is to ask anybody, what's the most important thing for you right now? And it could be a quick way to ground and focus people who are being pulled in all kinds of directions. And even if they say, I don't even know where to start, that opens a door to further relationship and say, well, let's talk about that and how you're feeling right now. Asking what's the hardest part can be really helpful too for people. And again, it leaves it up to the griever to draw a boundary and say, I'm not ready to talk about that, but they'll definitely appreciate that you asked. When we talk about grief, oh my goodness, only one of these is in the DSM-5. But gosh, the way we talk about grief is very pathological. Look at this, right? My goodness, complicated grief, of course, is in the DSM-5. But wow, wow, wow. Okay, I love Gary Scribbler. He's on Twitter or X or whatever Musk is calling it now, and he's an artist and he draws. This is how he's grieving through the loss of his wife. He's thinking about grief and he doodles about it, and they're just so profound. So this woman is being really compassionate. I think she's saying, I'm so sorry. There are no words. I've said that. You've probably said that too. And I love how Gary calls us on it, actually, because it seems like she's saying, I'm trying to honor that your loss is so devastating. There's nothing that I could ever speak to it. But in a way, she's also distancing herself from him, right? There are no words. There's no conversation to have. There's nothing I could say anyway. So bye. And Gary says, holding her hands to keep her there, actually, there are lots of words. I just need you to start using them, right? We just need to enter into a relationship together. I think that's just a beautiful way to think about it. So when we talk about these different words, loss, mourning, bereavement, they all kind of get fuzzy, and definitions aren't perfect by any means. No one really owns the definitive version of these terms, but sometimes I like to sharpen up my own microscope with it, just so I'm clear in my own head and heart and my practice about what we're talking about. So I hope this might be helpful to you. Loss is just trying to name the experience that someone or something meaningful that was once present to us is now painfully absent. And as you see from this beautiful picture from What's Your Grief, when we're thinking about the death of a person, you can see the cascade of losses that ripple out from that just spiral out in that person's life, right? I'm not a big fan of the primary secondary language because we make it a hierarchy, and I'm not into that, but I love what they're doing here to get us to think about that. So loss can be validated by other people around you, and sometimes it isn't, but it's always valid for the person who's experiencing it. And we'll all experience loss, right? And death is a kind of loss. And when I was very small, when I was 10, I would say things like, I lost my mom. I no longer say that. And I certainly learned how to stop saying that because of my faith community's rich traditions of educating me and kind of rebelling a bit against the grief culture, because it's like saying to a kid, right, so I lost my mom. I guess I'll just go put a wanted poster up on the phone pole and hopefully she'll be returned to me one day. That's not really what we're talking about with death. We got to find a different way to talk about that. So when we talk about grief, if Mary Ellen is on the call today, I got to thank her for this. She's our research chair. This first dimension is from some of her work, is remembering that grief is an embodied response to loss. Think about how that changes how you think about grief. It's multidimensional. It affects all of our life's domains: physical, emotional, behavior, social, financial, and spiritual. Right? We rarely think about it in those terms. We kind of constrict grief to this kind of emotional thing that we don't know what to do with. right? So it can be a response to loss, trauma, changes in behavior, a change in a familiar pattern. It is not pathological. I don't like using this word, but because it's the cultural vernacular, I will. So many people will say to me, Matt, I think I'm crazy. Like people are treating me like I'm crazy to feel this way. It's like, no, you're not. And no, you do not have a personality disorder. Um, One of the things that I think is really helpful on the emotional side is from acceptance and commitment therapy, the emotional weather metaphor. And it's to try to take some of the judgment and stigma out of our emotions because we moralize about how people feel all the time, whether it's right or wrong, good or bad. So none of that really applies to emotion. Think about it. It comes from, it's hardwired into our brain and our bodies in an evolutionary sense. It's like we don't have huge amounts of control always over that. Weather comes into our lives and it goes out. So there's some kinds of weather I really like spending time with, and there's other kinds of weather I'd sure like to avoid, but I have no control over that. And I don't need to moralize about whether it's good or bad. Let's just get to know our emotions and get more comfortable with them and take all that moralizing out, or at least reduce it if we can. When we talk about stages of grief, I mean, here's the classic five that Kubler-Ross came up with, not just about death, but any kind of loss. Sometimes you'll see a few extra stages added. Unfortunately, I find this kind of theory has been fairly corrupted in our popular culture because I don't think she ever meant that it was to be, this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you're done stage, and you've gotten rid of all your attachments. You no longer think about your grief anymore, and somehow that's the goal, is to detach from your loss. Um, these stages aren't discrete or well defined. They're not chronological. Not everybody experiences all of them. They ebb and flow. Think about it as something fluid versus something that's static. And they can stop and start at any time in people's grief journey. Sometimes they come back long after when we think they're resolved. I think a much better model for grief, really, that cuts more to the heart of some of the things that are going on in our culture is Growing Around Grief by Lois Tonkin. I love her work. And so, this first line is what we all kind of get in our culture. People think that grief slowly gets smaller with time and then poof, it magically disappears. And Tonkin goes, in reality, the grief stays the same size. It's our life that slowly begins to grow around the grief, and our grief and our loss is integrated into insightful ways and meaningful ways into who we are as a human being and how we experience life. So you can grieve anything that's significant to you. It's not predictable, doesn't have a set timeline. Nobody grieves the same way. It's multifaceted, and your grief will take lots of different shapes for all of us over time. I really got to thank Russ Harris for this because it's the person I'm the most familiar with using this metaphor. But we all have a response hardwired in our autonomic nervous system when it comes to threats. And we need to put on our Paleolithic brains right now. I apologize for the gendered language, which is not something I like a whole lot, but it's just easier for me for this story to talk about caveman, Dave man. So let's go back to caveman Dave man's times. He leaves his cave. He's got his trusty spear. He's going to go hunting. And he goes out into the woods. And lo and behold, he's surprised. Comes crashing through the woods is this giant bear. Well, his autonomic nervous system kicks in right away before he even has a conscious way to think about it, right? So he's going into fight or flight mode. His nervous system, right, is causing muscles to tense up, ready for action. The body's flooding with adrenaline. The heart is racing. Blood is flowing and increasing. The lungs are expanding. Muscles are getting bigger. And he doesn't even think about it. He throws the spear automatically as a fight response. Here's the bad thing for caveman Dave man. Totally misses the mark with the spear. He just ticks the bear off, right? So now the bear is really enraged and is chasing him down, and automatically he's running. And all these things our CNS has done to really help our body be able to run as fast as possible and get away from that threat. But Dave can't outrun the bear. The bear knocks him down, and immediately he goes into freeze. His nervous system switches over. His nerve turns on, which is the second largest nerve in our body besides our spinal cord, and it immobilizes Dave. Right, his muscles are paralyzed. He doesn't move anymore, and it's able to shut off his body's ability to feel. And you'll see this happen in nature between creatures, between predator prey. Right, so Dave just freezes, and in this case, well, bears don't really like prey that doesn't move. So the bear leaves him alone and walks off. That's a highly traumatic event. Thing is with trauma is just because something is traumatic doesn't mean the person's traumatized. And what you often watch in the natural world is any other creature or somebody like caveman Dave man in his time would get up, shake it off like your dog does, and go right back on the hunt, right? The thing is with our world today is that we don't have saber-toothed tigers chasing us or bears, but we have cancer deaths, we have mass shootings like the one in Portapique in Nova Scotia, we have floods and fires like we had in Nova Scotia, we've got Israel-Palestine in almost World War III, we've got a housing crisis, a poverty crisis, we've got food insecurity, we've got global warming, we've got the COVID pandemic that we're still recovering from. Our brain is always wired to scan for threats, and there's so many threats that our CNS is often turned on too much. And learning skill to say to our central nervous system, okay, this is a threat you've identified, but you know what? We're going to go into this. And just like our dog, for example, is a great example, we're going to shake it off and recover it and return to more of whatever's normal for our baseline. But sometimes what happens to people is they can't turn off that threat assessment brain, and they're always on edge. They're always on the edge all the time. Everything is so intense and they can't come down. And when that happens over a long period of time, you get complicated grief, right? And so here is a slide from the Mayo Clinic that kind of talks a little bit about that. All the references to all the slides are attached at the end. So I'll leave that for you to take a look at on your own time. But the big thing for complicated grief I wanted to mention was really that we often will see complicated grief occur when death happens without warning. It's the death of a child or horrific circumstances. A body isn't recovered. It's particularly violent or brutal, or it's multiple deaths or suicide. So we're intimately familiar with this in Nova Scotia because of the mass shooting. And we certainly are seeing complicated grief across the province. I want to talk about disenfranchised grief a little bit. That's really important too. And this is a grief that's not acknowledged by society, by the healthcare culture, or other power players in society, or by individuals. There's 4 types there that you can read about, but this cartoon does a great job of demonstrating it. Here we've got this. It looks like could be a parental figure saying, hey boy, why are you crying so much after your grandfather? You're only 6 years old. Do you even understand anything about death? Why are you upset all the time? And here we've got the 6-year-old who is imagining maybe the only figure they actually had a healthy attachment to, which is the grandfather. You can see them playing chess there. And now that person is no longer in their life. Imagine the trauma, imagine the disruption in attachment, in how that's going to affect that 6-year-old. They know lots about death and how this is going to affect them, and that's not being acknowledged. I had a friend of mine who is gay, was married for 10 years, in a relationship for 10 years with his partner. They decided rather not to get married. And when his partner died of cancer, he was really grieving this hard for quite a long time. It was just causing so many problems even years after in his life. And his sister eventually said to him one day, like, what's your problem? Why can't you get over this? It's not like you were married or anything. That's disenfranchised grief. When I was 10 and my friends in the neighborhood knew that my mom had died, they were all like, why are you playing with us? If my mom died, I'd be in my room crying. Like, you must not be sad that your mom died, right? We all grieve differently. And I'll talk about that grief response, that freeze response a little bit later, I think, as well. Another one that I'd want to share around a cultural perspective and a racial perspective would be, I was working with an 80-ish-year-old woman who is from Eastern Europe one time, beautiful Muslim lady, couldn't speak a lick of English, and was fleeing persecution in her home country, trying to start a new life in Nova Scotia. And so one day we get this call that she has had an altercation with police. And we were like, what? And so I went to talk to her about, like, how does an 80-year-old how does this happen? So we go to talk to her, and here's what happened. Is she was out for a walk one day, and she went to a park, and in the park there were all kinds of flowers and plants, and she was just entranced with how beautiful this was. It was spring, and so she went and she just began to dig up a tulip with her hands, and she was carrying the tulip home. The woman didn't have a lick of furniture, and she was carrying this tulip home, and someone called the police on her. And when we interviewed her about it, she roughly translated what she was saying was, I have seen so much death in my life. I just wanted to have a little something beautiful in my home. I just wanted to see something beautiful again, right? Again, look at what happens when we're not in relationship, when we're not literate about our grief, not educated about it, not putting it up front, that loss is everywhere. How do we live with it? How are we in relationship with it? Folks will often ask me, Matt, like, can I grieve somebody I haven't met? Absolutely, you can. And here's an example from Facebook. Here's a granddaughter grieving a grandfather she never met, was dead long before she was ever born. She's had her own kids now and has her own family system put together. And this is like a love letter written on the anniversary of a grandfather's death that she never met. This is what I would call a continuing bond. And sometimes I will often excuse the cultural vernacular, but people will say, Matt, I feel like I'm crazy, like I'm talking to this dead relative or what have you, or I've got this ritual I do and everybody thinks I'm losing it. Continuing bonds, Silverman and her group, I've got it in the references there, created really amazing research on this, that they're so healthy and so important for good integration of our grief. It's when we develop a set of memories, feelings, and actions that help us stay connected to the person who died, rather than assume that the whole goal of our grief journey is just to get rid of that person. It's to kick them out of our lives and our memory and our hearts so that there's no more pain. We just want to avoid that. That's never a healthy way to go. When we talk about bereavement, that's a funny one for me. It's the one that I have the most discomfort with, honestly, personally. But I try to think of bereavement as the state of having suffered a loss of another living thing or person that's you have a meaningful relationship with. So their grief is their full-bodied response to a loss, and bereavement is a way of describing the state that they're in of that loss. That's just personally how I find it easier to keep in my mind. And lastly, mourning in these terms, right? Mourning is just how we show grief in public, which is somebody who's trained as a social cultural anthropologist is endlessly fascinating. Here's the church in Portapic. When the shrine was sort of there, we've got the red dress or the red cassock for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Every Child Matters. Across the country, we saw this mourning happen, people leaving children's shoes all over the place. As we were trying to work through our grief in a national way. There's a ghost bike in Halifax for Joanna Dean, and her bicycle has come to represent all cyclists that have been run down in the Halifax area. Think about Remembrance Day. That's a national event of mourning. That's all of us thinking, processing our grief together with ritual in public. So when we use mourning, that's what we're talking about. So let's talk about myths, stigma, euphemisms, and platitudes. And this is almost the only meme I like about grief. Grief sucks. It just does. There's nothing good about grief, right? Like all this other stuff that tries to take the pain out of grief, not helpful, in my opinion. So when we think about myths, I just want to go through a few of these with everyone. The pain will go away faster if you ignore it. We've established that good evidence will say in every discipline that is a bad idea. No, we need to be supported and courageous in being able to enter into our pain. Myth, it's important to be strong in the face of loss. And when I'm working with parents, where like maybe it's a partner who's died in their family or one of the children who has died, other well-meaning family and friends will say, you can't grieve too long. You got to be there for this little person or for your partner. You got to go to work. You got to put bread on the table. Like you can't be falling apart. It's so destructive. Myth of if you don't cry, you aren't sorry about the loss. And for me, this was the freeze response. I often be totally overwhelmed when called out of my grief by other people in public about my mom. That was my reaction to how everything went down. I will often see this too. Again, it's highly individual, but I've certainly seen this happen where we're at a funeral and dad, was a serial abuser of one of the kids. And so everybody's wondering, why isn't she like more upset as her dad? Like everybody's talking about how great her dad is, and she's not crying at all. Why is that? It's not that she's not grieving. It's grief is highly individual, and we don't always know the story behind that grief. And she's actually having froze, right? Like that's her response to what happened. So being in relationship, knowing these things is really important rather than making assumptions. Myth of that grief should last about a year. I don't know who came up with this, but they should. I don't know. That's just terrible. Grief has no timeline. It really doesn't, and it's up to you. It doesn't really go away, but like I say, I do think it can become part of our lived identity and offer insight into who we are in this human life. I'm not going to go through all these, but wow, there's so much stigma with grief. You can come back and look at this later. There's so many statements out there that imply blame, shame, they diminish the importance of a loss, or they discourage grief. They make it seem abnormal. They try to bypass the pain. They put people under undue pressure, or they imply weakness. And this is good for us to review and just kind of know so that we can name it in our own interactions with people. When I think about euphemisms, there's a horde of them for grief, but especially for death. And when we're using euphemisms, they're like gentler, vague words that we want to describe something that could be unpleasant or shameful. We just don't want to name it because it's uncomfortable or it's not nice or polite. So when I was a kid, that was what I was taught. That's what I picked up in the culture, is that I had lost my mom. And my faith community and my brother and my dad were so great at saying, Matt, let's think about how mom has died, because she has, right? She hasn't just passed away or been lost. She's not just at rest, resting in peace, or gone to a better place, but she has died. And we had wonderful ways. And, at a future time, we can talk about how to talk to kids about death. I've done a lot of that in my life, as well as had good modeling around how to do that. And I'm sorry for your loss, for your loss thing. Just I'm sorry for you, right? I'm sorry this happened to you is great. We don't need the loss piece. Here's a piece that Gary Andrews drew that I love, right? So he's going Christmas shopping. His wife died, and his daughter's name is Lily, and he's looking to go and pick things up for Christmas. And just imagining this conversation with his wife, who would have been so much more wise than he was in terms of their family dynamic and how it works. And he's just trying to make this up as he goes along and being overwhelmed by it. That's the level of what we're talking about. Like, death is real. She's not just lost. She isn't there for those conversations. You lose your keys, your phone, your wallet. And when we do that, as frustrating as it is and as painful as it can be sometimes, unless you got like air tags, you can find or replace those, right? You can find or replace those. And so just remembering that we can't really replace the people who have died, and that's just the gravity of that, and honoring the gravity is really important permission giving, and gives people a lot of courage when we're able to do that in a gentle way. When it comes to platitudes, got to be honest with everybody, they don't help much. Like, here's a cute picture of a kitten instead. This kitten has a whole lot more to say to us about the nature of existence than platitudes. Platitudes, in all seriousness, they're vacuous, right? They're moralizing statements that are like rubber bands that we've wrapped around literally everything, to the point that it doesn't mean anything to anybody anymore, really, even though they can come from a compassionate place. And I don't want to pretend that they often don't. They do, and I've used them, folks, before as well. But I just don't think they're really helpful when it comes to grief. And you'll see some of these here. I won't go through all of them, but I like to collect these as I've been doing my grief and bereavement work, in meeting with people and families. And I can say for all of these, I've heard from hundreds of families the additional grief that this has caused, that people have related to them in these ways. So we can be better companions by just pushing past these platitudes and really becoming more grief literate. Think about how can we relate to grief, our own and others, in a different way. So some takeaways from that is just, platitudes only work when we've misunderstood correlation and causality, and kind of knowing the difference there is the difference between maybe potentially bringing harm to someone, or really bringing something somebody can relate to. It's okay as a griever to give yourself permission to say, our support network is great, and everybody will talk about that. But sometimes the people in your support network are really unhelpful and maybe even toxic. So it's okay to draw a boundary around that and say, thanks, but no thanks. Like, that's actually not great advice for me. I think that if we always assume that people are doing the best they can with what they got, we can appreciate that no matter how someone's relating to you with their grief or their well-wishing, trying to bring healing into the situation, it's almost always coming from a place of compassion. Very few people mean anything malicious in that. It's just we can change. We can make this a safer, more thoughtful space. So this is from Brene Brown, and boundaries, empathy, and compassion. These three things are related. The boundary of saying, your experience is your own. I don't need to get enmeshed with that. I don't need to insert myself with that. I can empathetically learn how to connect with your pain where I'm not in the middle of it. And the great thing about empathy is it's a learned skill. So we can all learn empathy and build bigger empathetic muscles. And that's just going to be a driver for the thing that everybody, particularly in healthcare and community, wants, which is a world with more compassion. So there are certainly ways to do that, and I've suggested some of the references. So here's some things we can do, right, that are super helpful. So say the person's name. I can't tell you how many funerals I've been to where the presider has actually never said the name of the person who died in the whole death ritual. Like, just blows my mind. And that's so hard on the family and the people who have gathered. You say you're sorry. That's a compassionate statement. There's nothing wrong with that. I think most people appreciate it. I can't imagine what you're going through. I miss them too. Thanks for having the courage to share your grief with me. It's not your fault. How can I support you in this moment? I want you to know that, jeepers, I've been thinking about you and I just want you to know that I care. Or I was remembering that time when we were all out for coffee and this funny thing happened, sharing a story. I wish I'd known them if you didn't. Or could I get to know them through you? Could we have that conversation? And the griever can always say, I'm just not ready to do that and draw a boundary around it. They will be delighted in most cases to know that you thought that much to ask that question. No one ever says to grieving people, very rarely, it's really good to see you, right? What'd you do today? What have you found that seems to help? These are important normalizing, I think, questions for us to have. Things we can do to cope that I think are really important. Physically think about it. It's a somatic experience. So all this energy is in our body. How do we work with that energy and let it out and express it? Emotionally, what can we do? Right? Here's a whole list of ideas of things we might do. Connection. I can't encourage that enough. I've got Kristen Neff's link there for self-compassion. Huge if you're grieving, or to give as a resource to somebody who is, to be a little more gentle on themselves. Peer groups are springing up everywhere around grief and bereavement. And of course, there's diversity, but lots of them are beautiful and wonderful. And you can trust the ones that you're going to through hospice or your health provider. Virtual gatherings, support groups, go to a death cafe, write someone a card. Absolutely. Insight, write your own grief story. Have you ever done that? Do it with art, with music, with poetry, however that works for you. Take an online course, go to one-to-one therapy or group therapy. Read up about it, as we've got lots of resources for you to do that. And I'm sure there's more that others on the call who are more knowledgeable than I can share. These are all great ways to do that. So I want to close today. I'm mindful of time. I want to close with my last piece here, which is the crater of grief, which is my own metaphor that I really like to use in my own work. So I'm going to think about this for a second and sort of leave you with this. The thing is with grief and a loss is often we don't see the loss coming. It blindsides us. It enters into our atmosphere and boom, right? It creates this huge impact in our life. And you can see, just like Tonkin was saying, like here's this circle of grief in the landscape now. It's changed in our life, and you can see the ripples of energy moving out from it. There's light and there's dark there in various degrees of both. It's a pretty mixed up place to be, isn't it? When you're in the middle of your grief, it can seem overwhelming because you can't see anything else. Like you're in the bottom of this hole, and all the emotion you're feeling and everything that's happening around you is like right in front of your face. So you really can't see a way out. It kind of can sometimes feel like you're trapped down here. Like there's no way I can climb up that hill. There's no food there. It doesn't look like there's a lot of life there. You're not going to get a lot of sleep there. It's a tough place to be, isn't it? I don't think I want to be there. If we work with grief the way we've been talking about, if we're in relationship with our grief and others are in that relationship with us in the way that we've named, in a grief informed and literate way, I think eventually we might achieve this kind of awareness where we start to say, hey, you know what? This grief is pretty devastating. You know what? My life has lots of loss in it, though. And some of them are bigger and wider and deeper, and some of them are really small. But my life is full of loss, actually. And I've made it through all of that, too. And that tells me something about who I am as a human being and how I dealt with those losses and how I can respond today. And the more and more we work on this together, we might just come to see that actually our loss and our grief aren't ugly or shameful, that they've got a place, which is in us, that it's beautiful. It's part of the beauty of the human experience. When we look to the moon, it's filled with craters, and it's one of the most captivating objects in the night sky that held our imagination for time immemorial, right? This is the beauty, I think, of integrating our loss into who we are. And I hope that's the journey that we can go on culturally and socially with grief, that it becomes something we really can look to and talk about. So I really appreciate everyone's time today, and I hope we have a little bit of time for questions. Thanks, Diana, for all of that, and thank you for joining me on the ride, everyone.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Definitely, you gave us a lot to think about today. I'm going to jump right into the questions. We have a few, so I'll start off by reading them out loud to you. We have somebody that's asking, how do you know that only a small segment of the population needs clinical or therapeutic intervention? Based on what assessment tools, studies? Thank you.
So what I would offer to that is I can actually, if you provide me your email, I'll send you the research. Is the easiest way to say that. So when I'm drawing on that, it's not like Matt's take on this. That's well conducted research, particularly in Europe and around the world, of this model we showed you from Irish Hospice and the work that they've done there. So I can certainly resource that to you, but good evidence-based collection and data.
Fantastic. I would ask the person that did indicate that, because
Do
you are
that.
anonymous, to please include your email in the chat for us. Thank you so much.
Absolutely love to tell you more and point you in a direction where you can learn more about it.
Okay, great. So then we have from Marnie Thompson, and yet we know sometimes grief is pathological. How do you see support for people struggling with prolonged grief disorder?
That's a great question. How do I see the support for it? I think if we're in good relationship with our grief, I mean, at a clinical level, there are definitely assessment tools we can use, right? And I think there are cues we can look for. I'm no expert in prolonged grief or complex grief. I don't think it's what I get cautious about with grief is just like our society, because we've got more therapeutic language in the culture and people are using that language all the time. In a way, that term gets thrown around quite a lot, that someone's grief is complicated or is actually complex grief. So I think relying on screening tools as clinicians and doing best practice around that, in the relationship with clients, having ways along the trajectory of someone's journey with their grief, if they're contacting service providers, to be able to have those periodic check-ins and look at what's happening and presenting in the client are probably waypoints for us to be able to check and check and check to see where people are on that triangle, if they're really up here in their complex grief, or if they're starting to be able to have that effectively treated.
Fantastic. Again, from Marnie Thompson, I also love the Tonkin model. And in using it in my teaching and clinical practice, I've learned that some people would or do say their grief has changed, so growing bigger and smaller at times. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I would say that when we're working with grief, Marnie, you're bang on, is that like there's really few like absolutes, right? Because it's so individual. Like you're never going to account for everything. So just like when I was saying with the definitions, I think it's a good humility piece for us to go, these can be helpful, but they're not going to capture everything. And I love that someone's had that experience. And I would describe that, like I can really relate to that in the sense that in the multiple losses I've had in my life, I think my life has grown around that loss. But that loss also isn't sort of like this all the time. It hasn't stayed that size. Its size really has changed. And I think what Tonkin's trying to draw our attention to is sort of that preoccupation with saying, we just need to get rid of the grief. We need to get rid of the pain. Like it has to go away as fast as possible because it's so uncomfortable and difficult to deal with.
Yeah. And once again from Marty, can you please speak to how or if you distinguish between complicated grief and prolonged grief disorder?
Ooh, the one that I'm the most familiar with, and there are probably people on the call who are better to answer that question than me, to be honest, Marnie, because I'm not dealing in a clinical facing way in mental health, for example, or a mental health service provider that way in my role. So there are probably clinicians on the line who can drop something in the chat there, or maybe in another way to kind of offer a little bit of wisdom and insight on that, because I'm sure there are folks here who can answer that question.
Of course, no problem. We do have somebody who has their hand up. We have Peter Barnes who has his hand up. Peter, go right ahead. You might want to unmute yourself. There we go. It's coming in.
Thank you.
Yes.
Matthew, thank you very much for this. It's really a great to feel your enthusiasm and your knowledge. I really appreciate it. I'm curious, Matthew, about mediums and psychics. I'm wondering, have you collaborated with them, or have you referred people to them, or how do you understand the value of people, because many, many, many people who are grieving consult because they're longing for the connection. They are longing for reassurance that their loved one is okay. And they turn to mediums and psychics for this. So have you reflected on this, or do you know any literature that speaks to this?
Oh, Peter, that's a fabulous question. And I think to the questions about sort of prolonged grief disorder as well, so we've got this yearning that's involved and yearning's an interesting thing to look at, I think, with grief. And when that gets sort of excessive in our lives, and how do you negotiate that, right? To see, is that something that is really bringing some kind of harm to somebody or not? And I would certainly have lots of people through the years, because in working in ministry and working with the general public, people are coming from all walks of life, right? So I've certainly had people who have said, Matt, I'm consulting a psychic, or they said this to me about my loved one and how they feel. I just want to honor that at my stage of my work. I'm trying not to judge that. It's meaningful for them. And I think that's probably the biggest piece that brings often people a sense of deep comfort, of being a way to explore that continuing bond. So I guess, Peter, that's kind of how I look at it. I don't have any resources you could throw your way on that end, but that's a great lens to think about in the grief world. Yeah, but I would look at it as a continuing bond for people. It's a way for people to talk to, process their grief, uphold that relationship, still feel a level of connection. And I mean, I don't know if that's all that far from, for example, you can't see it, I'm not going to change the camera, but on my wall is a photograph from a parent whose child died of childhood cancer, and it was devastating for her. She's a photographer, and one of the things that she started doing, and I don't think this is all that different than talking to a medium or a psychic, right, is she would take pictures of wherever she would see a message from her son. So this particular image I'm looking at right now, it's a cloudy day, and the way the sun is shining through the clouds, it looks like a heart. And she considered that a message from her son that everything was okay. I mean, I wouldn't say that's beyond the pale, right? I would honor that. And that's why I have it on my wall too, remembering how powerful those continuing bonds are and how we think about and relate to our grief. So yeah, that's the best I can do on that one, Peter.
Thank you so much. I will wrap it up with one last question, and I think we can end the session with that. Kim asks, why do you suggest to look for in a grief counselor?
What do I suggest to look for in a grief counselor?
Yeah.
I think someone who is trained in your kind of loss is always really helpful. Grief training can be a little bit ubiquitous out there. Like, what kind of grief training are we talking about? There are lots of different kind of competencies and scales and such, but I think that's a great place to start, is that, like, if you have a very particular kind of loss, try to find somebody who's within that pocket, or who's dealt with clients before and had success, and just when you're talking to a potential clinician, to be able to have that conversation. You can do a little bit of research for yourself too, because there's so much out there on the internet of saying, like, gosh, I wonder, what kind of therapies are available for grief and bereavement in my area? What kind of specialties do people have? And do a little research around, how does that kind of therapy sound? Do I think that I would relate well to that? And, sometimes a great resource can definitely be calling your hospice, calling peer support groups and those kinds of things, maybe asking if there's anybody that they've had great success with. That can often be a good way to go too.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Matthew. Definitely super, super insightful. I'd like to thank everybody that has taken the time to join us today. We have included into the chat a feedback survey. We always love to hear what you think about this session. And a lot of you have, just so you know, Matthew said that they loved that it was a wonderful session, very insightful presentation, very real is something that we read as well. So absolutely fantastic. It just keeps coming in. Thank you so much, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you at next time. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.